The first thing I'm going to say, and some of you have heard this before, but it bears repeating, read and research, online and otherwise. It used to be difficult. You'd have to go to the local library and pray they had a literary journal or two that you could study and, you know, see whether or not your work was a fit. But everybody's online now, so even for magazines and journals that don't have an online version, they have a web presence and they'll have guidelines to submit and all of that, and usually samples of their poems or stories or essays, whatever they publish. So, you know, you can read the samples and see if those feel like a fit with your aesthetic. And I can tell you, before I worked for Ellis James, I worked for a university press, and we published fiction, nonfiction, decorative arts, poetry, you name it. And the number one reason for rejection was people didn't bother to read and research. They would send us wildly inappropriate submissions, you know. So really important to do. And even if, you know, if it's poetry, there's such a range of poetic styles now, right? There's avant-garde, experimental, elliptical, and there's narrative, lyric, prose poetry, poem and received forms. So you want to be sure that you're sending to a place that even publishes the sort of work that you write. And that would apply to fiction, nonfiction as well. There's more avant-garde writing, flash fiction, etc. So, and I wanted to say too, I'm talking mostly about poetry here, but a lot of this applies to fiction and nonfiction as well. If you hear poem, substitute essay, short story in your mind, then a lot of it's the same. And when I do Q&A, if any of you have questions about fiction, nonfiction, I'll be happy to answer those. And if I don't know, I'll defer to someone in our audience who does know. So going down the list here, subscribe to at least one literary magazine or journal. If we don't support them, who's going to? And you know, what I generally do is I sort of vary that. Instead of subscribing to one or two literary journals for years and years, I try to subscribe to different ones each year so that, you know, I support more of them and I get a better idea, close up of what they're doing. When you think you're ready to send out, try to get an objective opinion of your work's readiness and the level you're at. You know, should I be sending to the New Yorker or should I be sending to, you know, somewhere else along the spectrum? And for those of you that are in this program, you can ask your advisor. When I'm your advisor, you're welcome to ask me and I will make suggestions for where you might send them. This is another obvious one. Read the submission guidelines and follow them. I can't tell you how often at Ellis James people call up and say, well, it says 50 to 70 pages. Can I send 90? It's like, no. If you want, you know, if you want your poems or your stories back, make sure that you enclose a self-addressed stamped envelope, otherwise known as an SASE, with appropriate postage. More and more places now are going to electronic online submissions, and I think eventually almost no one is going to be taking hard copy anymore. So, I mean, to me that's really good news because it makes submitting so much easier and cheaper because you don't have to like go physically to the post office and pay money, and you can just kind of press a button. It's really great. If you're writing a cover letter, which if you're sending a group of poems or a story or an essay to a journal or a magazine, you're going to want a cover letter. I recommend keeping it pretty basic, and I have a sample here, and Lexi has guidelines too for that. But when I'm submitting poems, you know, if you want to start with, you know, a line or two about, you know, how much you like the journal and your favorite issue or your favorite poet or something like that, you can. I used to always advise that, and a lot of other editors I know did too, but I feel like there's a little bit of a sea change going on there, and I think it may be because all of us advising writers to do that for so long now, there are some editors who get really annoyed by that because they feel like it's insincere. Like the person didn't really read, you know, their journal, they just did just enough research to write the sentence. So it's also fine if you just say, you know, I'm submitting these 5 poems for consideration, list the titles, and then put a bio, and your bio will evolve as you go along. You know, if you haven't published anything yet, you know, you can just say, I'm in, you know, the Sierra Nevada MFA program, or I have my MFA. And then as you start to get publications, you know, list whatever you have. And as you go on and you get more publications and you get sexier publications, then you can start swapping them out. So, you know, swap out the publication in your local newspaper for, you know, Antioch Review or whatever it is. So that'll be an evolving thing. And for the bio, you can put it in first person or you can put it in third. I put mine in third because it feels more comfortable to me. And it's also handy for the publisher because if they take your work, they're going to want your bio, and it needs to be in third person then, so they've already got it there if they want it. And I always end with, thanking them, the editor, for their time. Make sure you're addressing them by name, if you can find out the name. And if you want, the poems returned, make sure that you say that at the bottom of the letter. If you don't, and you're sending a hard copy submission, you can say, just please recycle these. So that's it, really pretty basic. If you're submitting a manuscript, that's a different story, but we'll get to that. In cover letters, be professional, courteous, brief, and error-free. Again, it all sounds really basic, but I could tell you stories. Develop relationships with editors. So if you have a chance to go to the Associated Writing Programs Conference, which is in Boston this year, go to the book fair, meet the editors of the journals and magazines and book publishers that you admire. At least pretend to take an interest in what they've got on the table in front of you. Pick some things up, maybe read some, maybe buy a book or a magazine. And that's part of, writers mostly never want to think that we need to make work as writers, but if you want to get published, it's like any other business really, and it's the same as if you were applying for a job somewhere. If you show up in person with the resume, or you submit it electronically and you show up in person, it makes a difference. They have a face, they have a pleasing personality, and it can give you just that little edge. So then when you submit poems or stories to that editor, you can say, oh, we met at AWP. And by the way, anytime you have any kind of an in like that, you've met the editor, or if one of your advisors says, tell this editor I suggested you send there, make sure you do that. Get performance coaching. These days, no writer who wants to continue having their books published is going to, if they're not willing to get out there and give live readings. And you want to be the best reader you can for all kinds of reasons. You'll sell more books, you'll develop a bigger audience, you'll get more invitations and better reading invitations, and you will get paid better, and your publisher will love you and be that much more willing to publish your next book. Practice reading aloud. You can practice in front of a friend and have them, sort of give you coaching on that. There's plenty of advice online about, how to give a good speech or how to read well. And I've been giving readings now for, 25 years. I still rehearse every time I give a reading. And I select what I'm going to read in advance. I put little Post-it bookmarkers in there so I'm not fumbling around going, oh, excuse me, I can't find it, and everyone's sort of waiting while I shuffle papers in the microphone. So I have them numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I know just write the order. And if you have patter you don't want to forget, you can put little reminder notes about that on them. Something that it's important, especially if you're sending a book manuscript out, but web presence. I can remember when, we first started having, literature published online. In the beginning, I thought, I'm not sending any of my stuff. Well, those days are long past. I now advise writers you want a really good mix of hard copy, print copy publications, and e-zines, or good journals that have an online presence or an online version. Like Agni, they have a whole electronic edition and a print edition. And so if I'm an editor and I'm always looking for new voices, I can Google you and go, oh, look at that. This writer's really active. They published in all kinds of places. They're giving readings all over the place. And if you're looking at placing a book manuscript outside a contest, that matters, just as it will matter in the cover letter that you send. And part of getting that web presence is saying yes when people ask you to do web things. Can I post your poem on my blog? Hopefully you've already published the poem somewhere really good. But if they want to reprint, post the poem on the blog, yes. If people ask you to give readings in crazy places, say yes. You never know what will come out of that. Let's see. Okay, about getting your first collection of poetry published. The main venue for getting a first collection of poetry published, like it or not, are first book contests, or contests that are open to every level, including first books. And it costs a lot of money to enter those. I mean, it's now, I think, up to $30 and $35. There's still some that are maybe 20 or 25, but so you really want to do your research and be choosy about where you send. There are a few places, a few presses that will take unsolicited submissions for first books, and there are more of those now than there were a few years ago. However, a lot of those presses are charging a fee for that too, so it's not necessarily cheaper, but you're not competing for the big prize, whatever it is in the contest. So, you know, I mean, my advice is if you're sending out your first book manuscript for the first time, that you would start with the contest as a way to sort of gauge the level. I mean, I consider those few opportunities to send the unsolicited manuscript, those are rare and precious coins, and I don't want to spend them before I have a pretty good idea that the manuscript is really pretty much there. So if you submit to the contest, you know, most of the time you should be able to tell, you know, were you a semifinalist or a finalist? Did you go out in the first round? If you went out in the first round a bunch of times, I wouldn't send to the unsolicited yet. I'd wait till you're a finalist a couple of times, and then if you want to do that, fine, great. And there are a lot of presses where you can do both. You can send to their unsolicited reading period in the summer or whenever it is, and you can submit to the contest too. Again, some really obvious stuff along with the cover letter advice. Don't use scented paper or colored ink or really fancy curly fonts or really tiny fonts. Lots of editors are old, middle-aged, and they need reading glasses, and they're going to be really annoyed with you. Use normal margins and so forth. Don't volunteer your life story in a cover letter. I can't tell you how many cover letters I've read from, well, I was a CEO of a corporation, and now I think I'm a poet, and you know, there's like a page of being CEO in the corporation, and like, it's not that we don't care, but we don't really have time for all that, and it doesn't make any difference. Either the work is good enough to be published, or it isn't. And being a CEO in your past life is not going to help you. Let's see. In terms of editors, you don't want to pester editors. You know, most of them now say how long their response time is. But if they say their response time is 2 months, then it's 2.5 months or 3 months, and you haven't heard anything, inquire. Send a polite email or letter, depending on whichever way they prefer you contact them, and just say, you know, I submitted these poems, list the titles on such and such a date, you know, just checking to see whether or not you're still considering these or not. And if they don't bother to answer that, then you should feel free to withdraw them. Again, send a polite note withdrawing these from consideration. I have plenty of sympathy for editors having been one. They're overworked and they're underpaid and they're understaffed, but really there's a point. Most of them are writers too, and you know, if their response time is 6 months, which is I consider pretty long, and they're going to take longer than that, I'm sorry. I'm going to be 90 by the time I publish anything. So let's see. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about, let me see how much time I have here. I think we're okay. I want to talk a little bit about sending the manuscript out and, you know, figuring out when it's ready to send and how to do that. Of course, with fiction and nonfiction, you need agents. Poets don't have agents unless you're Julia Alvarez and you're also a fiction writer and your agent is agreeing to handle your poetry because they make so much money on your fiction, or some really, really famous poets who actually make money on their royalties and so forth. So poets, you don't need to worry about approaching agents. And before you send out the manuscript, I would recommend that you have a published friend or colleague take an objective, critical look at your manuscript. And you can even say to them, you're not allowed to praise, I just want an objective look. Is it ready to publish? Is the ordering of the poems working? Is the inclusion working? Meaning, are there poems in there that really should come out of